Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Great Southern Bioblitz, iNaturalist intermediate level with Thomas Mesaglio. My name is Michelle Neal, and I'm one of the international organisers here at Great Southern Bioblitz. Just going to share my screen. The Great Southern Bioblitz acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this event takes place, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome. I'd now like to introduce the Beachcomber, aka Thomas Mesaglio. I can never say your last name, Thomas. I'm sorry. aka Thomas, as I know him as. Over to you, Thomas.
No worries. Thanks, Michelle. So for anyone who hasn't come to one of my workshops on iNaturalist, pretty much the way it'll run is I'll use iNaturalist as I talk and basically run through functionality that I think is useful for people to learn and that hopefully people don't know about and that I am actually teaching them something. I've given a number of these intermediate level talks now. And through a lot of the ones that I've done in the past, I've kind of repeated a bit of content. So I am aware of the fact that there are some people that turn up to all of them. So I do like to try and freshen things up and present a few different new tips and tricks that I haven't talked about before, just so that people that are coming to multiple workshops are getting things out of each and every workshop, rather than me just repeating all the content. So I've really tried to up the ante on that today, and I'm hopefully going to go through a lot of stuff that I haven't talked about in previous presentations. And hopefully, yeah, people will learn from what I discuss and take something useful out of it. So in terms of the skill level, the beginner workshops that I run is I usually do the real basic functionality, like how to upload observations and how to make IDs and how to use the explore page. So in terms of this intermediate level workshop, it's probably a couple of notches up from that. So it's nothing super esoteric or obscure on the platform, but certainly functionality that I think is probably not super obvious or necessarily intuitive for a lot of people. But then once you learn about it and get shown it, it's pretty straightforward. So I'll run through iNaturalist with you guys now. And also please feel free to ask any questions at any time in the chat. You don't have to wait until the end. If there's something you're unsure about, or just something pops into your mind, or you want me to go back because I was going too fast, or just clarify something, please put a question in the chat at any time whatsoever. So the first thing I wanted to discuss today, and I think this is something that I haven't really covered before in any of my workshops, is the different types of places on iNaturalist. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize, but there are actually multiple different types of place. And there are also multiple different ways of searching for places as well. And it's a really important distinction to make between the two. So the two main types of place on iNaturalist are standard places and community curated places. And the difference between the two is quite important. So standard places are things like countries, states, counties in the US, or whatever their administrative equivalent is in other countries, continents, and I think there's about 400 and something national parks in the US that have been labeled as standard places as well. So these are all places that have been explicitly defined by iNaturalist as standard per se. And the reason that it's really important to know whether something is a standard place or not is to do with obscuration. And I can demonstrate this with a Norfolk Island example. So something that hopefully a lot of you are aware about is that when something gets obscured on, and actually I'll explain that as well. So just in case, for people that haven't been to these workshops before. So on iNaturalist, when you're setting the location for one of your observations, there are three different geo-privacy options. The first is open. And so as you would expect, this means that anyone can see all of your coordinates and location information for that particular observation. The next level up is obscured. And what obscured does is it takes the true coordinates of your observation and it randomly scrambles them into a roughly 29 by 29 kilometer square box. So it ends up being about 500 square kilometers, depending where you are on the globe. And it randomly scrambles it. So if you view your own observation, you can see the true coordinates that you put in. But if someone else was to view your observation, they would just see essentially a random point on the map. And that point, there will then be a 29 by 29 kilometer box around it. And I should say it's a 29 kilometer radius box. And so then people just see a random location essentially. And this is, obscuration is used if you say have observations that you've made at your house and you don't want people to be aware of where you live, or if you have some kind of rare organism that you've observed, perhaps it's an orchid that you're afraid people might poach if they see your location and then go back to it. The same thing gets used a lot with things like snakes and amphibians and other highly poached and collectible species. And what happens with obscuration, however, there's one kind of downside to it, and that's related to places. So let's say I have a search I want to execute, and I'm searching for a little nature reserve near my house, and I want to search for all the observations in that nature reserve that have been put on iNaturalist, so I can see what species have been observed there by other people, and so that when I go to the nature reserve myself, I have a few targets and perhaps I can find some species that other people haven't seen yet. If any observations were made in that area that were then obscured, they actually get bounced out of the place. So if a grey-headed flying fox, for example, which has its observations obscured on iNaturalist, and I'll just show you what this looks like as well, just to be completely clear, if I can actually get my fingers to work and type it in properly. So if I go to grey-headed flying fox and I click on any given observation, so this is what obscuration looks like, right? So you'll see that there's the blue point, which is supposedly where this observation was made. That's just an arbitrarily generated point. The true coordinates for this observation are somewhere in this blue box, right? Somewhere in this blue box. So that's all I'll see. So if I was searching in this little nature reserve, and it's a small nature reserve, and I was searching, and grey-headed flying foxes had been observed in that nature reserve, they won't actually appear in my search because the observation has been obscured and it will get bounced out of the place. However, and this comes back after my very long tangent, standard places, this doesn't happen. So it doesn't matter how small a standard place is. If there is an observation that is made inside that place, it doesn't matter if it's obscured, it will never get bounced out. And a really good way to demonstrate that is just with Norfolk Island. So you can see here in brackets. So this is another really good way of seeing what type of place something is. We'll type in Grant's Head there. Okay, great. So you can see here that you can, and I'll open this in a new tab as well. And then we'll go back to typing Norfolk. So you'll see here, when I type in Norfolk Island, there's a little gray text next to it that says country. And then here, Norfolk in England, it has gray text next to it that says county. So if you're typing in this search bar and you see this little gray text in brackets next to the place name, it means that it's a standard place. So it's one of these particular administrative levels that have been defined by iNaturalist as a standard place. Whereas you see when I started typing in this place, which is a place that I made on iNaturalist, you can see it doesn't have that text next to it. Or if it does have the text, in this case, this one doesn't have the text because it's too long a place name. But in this case, it says miscellaneous. And so you can see this is just an arbitrary set of boundaries that I created for a particular project I was doing. It has no administrative grounds. And so it's just a community created place. So if I was to observe something, say here, and it was obscured, it would end up getting bounced out and it wouldn't be included in my place. But if you look at something like Norfolk Island, and you look at all the observations, You can see there, the orange line is the borders, the defined borders of Norfolk Island, right? So it's the island itself and then the waters immediately around it. But you can see all these points that are actually outside the border. So these are all obscured points that if Norfolk Island was not a standard place, would have been completely lost. They would have been bounced out. But because it's a standard place, the obscured observations still get included. So that's just a really important thing to keep in mind. And it's most relevant when people are making projects. So a lot of times people will make projects to collate all their observations into one place. And more often than not, these projects are based on a place. So it might be I'm going out and I'm surveying a particular national park, or I'm surveying a particular nature reserve, and I want to collect all my observations in one place. And then a lot of times people will be wondering why observations are not getting included when they should have. Very, very often it's because the observations were obscured and they're getting bounced out of that place. But for standard places, that doesn't happen. The other really important thing about places is that there's two different ways to search for places on iNaturalist as well. One is with this bar up here, the main bar, and the other one is this bar when you're in the Explore page. And they're actually searching in two different places. So if I search up here, and let's do the Norfolk Island example again, you'll see that Norfolk Island comes up as an option. And I'm like, okay, that's totally fine. And if I go to the Explore page and I go to this location search bar and I type in Norfolk Island, it also comes up as well. But what happens if I try something different? Let's say I try typing in a street address and I'll type it in here. Let's go 48 Hector Street. And it works, right? I can find that address. Now let's type that in up here. You can see that there are no results. And the reason for that is that this search bar here specifically, the one where it says location, that is searching Google Maps. So this search bar here only searches in Google Maps. So if you're searching for a place name such as this street address, this one is only searching iNaturalist places. So this is the major difference between these two search bars. This one here searches in Google Maps. This one at the top searches for iNaturalist places specifically. So that means there are always going to be places that are missing in one but present in the other. So in this case, if I was to type in a street address, it appears in the Google Maps search, of course. But if I type it up here, it doesn't, because no place has been created for it. Whereas then if we look at the opposite and I type in that place I just showed you, I can find that place by searching up here. But if I was to search for this place in the Google Maps bar, you'll see that there's no results, right? None of these match. It doesn't appear because this is not a place that has been defined as a location in Google Maps. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're searching for something like a state, right, New South Wales, you can see it appears there. Or if I'm searching for New South Wales, it also appears here. So if you're searching for something like a country or a state or some kind of big place like that, it's totally fine. It doesn't matter what search bar you're looking in. But if you're looking for a specific iNaturalist place you've created, then it's always better to search for it up in this bar here, because more often than not, it will not appear in this search bar here. There is actually a second way to apply this search bar, and that's in filters, and then more filters, and then searching in place here. And so if I was to do that for my place, you'll see that it's going to appear. And then we can apply my place. But you'll notice that is 3 extra clicks. So if you're ever doing a combination of searches where you want to search for, say, a place and a particular group of organisms, or even if you're just searching for a place and you know that it's only a place that exists in iNaturalist, always use this search bar up here because it's a big time saver. So I can just straight away type in this, Grant's Head, and it'll appear for me straight away rather than having to go explore, 1 click, filters, 2nd click, more filters, 3 clicks, and then go down to the place and type it there. So it's a big time saver to be able to search for specific iNaturalist places up in this bar here. I'll just have a brief look in the chat because a few ones have popped up. Okay. So Colin and Wendy said, can field guides be created using iNaturalist? The online info seems a bit old. So you can create guides, and I can briefly show you how to do that. The one important thing to note about guides in iNaturalist is that they're an as-is feature. So essentially, they still exist, and you can create guides, but iNaturalist has stopped making changes to them or updating them. So if you find any bugs or issues with guides, they won't be fixed at this point. So the way to create guides is to go to the top toolbar, hover over More, and then you go to Guides. And so here you can see in the yellow warning, as of January 2019, the guides feature is presented as is, and there's no plans to develop it any further. So you can, by all means make guides, but if there are features you feel are lacking from guides or problems you encounter, unfortunately, they won't be fixed. So you can browse through existing guides to see what they look like, or you can just press this button, the white Create a Guide. You just give it a title, give it a description, save and start adding species. And from here, you can start adding taxa. So you can press Add Taxa, you can start adding a species. So we might go magpie, go true magpies, you'll go Add Taxa. And then from here, you can start adding things like photos, locations, licensing. You can add other editors. If I click on it, you can do a caption, you can add tags, a display name, you can write a description, all these kind of things. You can do a range as well, so you can upload a range. So a fairly decent range of functionality, but it's quite time consuming. I will know that. Creating guides using iNaturalist in this fashion is relatively time consuming because it's a very manual thing you have to do. And pretty much every individual species you want to add, you have to go through this whole rigmarole of searching for it, adding it, typing in all these aspects. So possibly other softwares may be a bit better suited because it is quite a time-consuming process. Colin Wendy also said, can we create a place using a GPX or KMZ file? Our local national park has had its boundaries mostly removed from Google Maps. So to my knowledge, no, you have to use a KML file, but it should be relatively easy, I think, to convert those. So there's a lot of really easy converters. So if you were to type convert KMZ to KML on Google, there are a decent amount of free conversion tools. It will just depend on how big the place is. So often with these free conversion tools, there is a limit to the size of the files that you can convert without having to get the paid version of the tool. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If your file place was too big and you couldn't convert it, if you happen to have software like ArcGIS, you can convert it. Or if you wanted to go to the trouble and do it the manual way, you can draw the boundaries in Google Earth, save that as a KML file, and then upload that as well. So there's a few different options there.
I just popped another one in the chat there, also from Colin.
Yep, no worries. Let me just look in the chat. Yeah, so Len as well said, if you drop a KMZ into a Google Earth, you can resave it as a KML. So from Colin, I believe ALA automatically scrambles some rare and sought after plants or animals. Does iNat do this? Yes, absolutely. So anything that has a conservation status of near threatened or above on iNaturalist, so that's near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered, every time you upload an observation to iNaturalist, it will automatically have its coordinates obscured and you have no choice. So very much so, that's a functionality that exists in iNaturalist. Having said that, not all taxa that do have that kind of status will have their observations obscured once they've been reviewed. So what I mean by that is, so initially, if you add a status, so all statuses have to be manually added. That's the first thing. So if you have some kind of species that is endangered, and the first time it gets observed on iNaturalist, it won't necessarily have that endangered tag applied to it. That's a status that needs to, in some cases, be manually applied by a curator. So if that happens, you can just flag the taxon, and that's something I'm going to discuss in a second. But you would flag the taxon, a curator would add the status of endangered, and then it will automatically have all existing observations will be retrospectively obscured, and then any observations that are uploaded from then on will be obscured. However, you can then reverse that obscuration. And the reason that that might happen is if the threats aren't relevant, if obscuration is not relevant to the threats. So for example, there are a lot of eucalypt species that are listed by the IUCN as vulnerable or endangered. But if you then actually look at what the threatening processes are for those species, it's things like drought, increasing temperatures, changed fire regimes. And the threats have nothing to do with human impact, and the species do not benefit at all from having their observations obscured. Whereas if you have something like a really rare cactus or a really rare orchid, where if someone was able to see the observation on iNaturalist and then use the location to go and find it and dig it up, then that becomes a problem. But for something like the eucalypts, it can actually be counterproductive to obscure those locations, because if there are researchers that want to use iNaturalist data, it's much more of a hassle for them to try and get the true locations if they've been obscured. And as I mentioned, for things like eucalypts, where they're threatened by climate change and increased fire, there's really no purpose whatsoever to have the observations obscured, because it doesn't matter whether someone knows where the tree is or not, it's not threatening them having their location open. So things that are threatened will have their observations obscured automatically upon upload. But if you believe that the observations shouldn't be obscured for some reason, then they can be reopened. But that really only happens after kind of a community discussion. And so Karen said, bearing that in mind, what happens if someone has a name place in the comments or notes section? That's a really good question. So that's a situation you encounter sometimes, where you have an observation and it's of something rare and it gets obscured, but then the person writes in the comments or in their notes the exact spot where they found it. In those cases, really the only course of action you can do is just to leave a comment for them and just say, could you please delete your comment just because it's revealing sensitive location information, and then really it's up to them whether they respond to you and do so. There's really not much more you can do than that. So when that does happen, it can be a bit of an unfortunate situation. Gary said, can I organize IAD entries in a project into alphabetical order? And also, can multiple entries of the same ID be merged into one? So you can't organize IDs in a project in alphabetical order, unfortunately, in any part of iNaturalist. The only way to organize observations or identifications in any aspect of the site is either by chronological order of observation, either descending or ascending, or by most observations to least observations of particular species, or by taxonomic organization. So there is no way within iNaturalist itself to organize any kind of ID or observation alphabetically. Unfortunately, you can do that. You can organize things alphabetically after you export into Excel, and I will go into that a little bit after. But short answer is no, unfortunately. You can't organize things alphabetically within iNaturalist. And as to, can multiple entries of the same ID be merged into one? Just to clarify, do you mean if there are, say, 4 observations of a galah, can they be merged into one in your project? Is that what you're talking about? And then in the meantime, I'll just answer the next question. Okay, yes. So the only way to do that is via this is in the species tab. So you can't actually collapse if you've got multiple observations of one species in a project, you cannot collapse those observations into essentially a single observation after the fact, only via the species tab. So just to clarify what I mean, if I go to this random project, and you can see if I go to observations, you can see here's one observation of a goose barnacle, Lepus ancerifera. Here is another observation of a goose barnacle, Lepus ancerifera. And then if I keep going down, here's another one. So there's multiple observations. The only way that I can collapse them per se into one entity is to go to the species tab and to look here. And you'll see that there is essentially one entry per se for the goose barnacle. But apart from that, no, there isn't a way unless you have it all. There might be workarounds, but it all depends on your specific project and your specific use case. So certainly feel free to either email me or message me on iNaturalist afterwards, and I'm more than happy to flesh that out more with you, just to clarify a bit more what you're asking about. Michelle said, are there Australian Indigenous place names in iNaturalist? Yes, so there are for some things. I've added a couple. So for Fraser Island, I believe is Fraser Island.
Kagari.
Yeah, I was wondering if it had, so it hasn't. No, okay, so Fraser Island hasn't, but Kings Park, I know that I did. So for Kings Park, I added the local Indigenous name, Cartagara. I would say on the most part, no, they're not present, but that's only because people haven't added them. So certainly Indigenous place names can be added for places. For the most part, it would likely have to be as something in brackets. So if I go to Fraser Island, for example, so if I was to go to Fraser Island and click about, and then I wanted to edit the place, you'll see that there isn't an option for me to put in multiple names. So this is the problem. This is the problem that you have with place names versus species names in iNaturalist in terms of Indigenous names. So if you were wanting to apply Indigenous names to individual species, then absolutely, it's very, very easy to do because any given species or genus or family or any taxonomic level in iNaturalist can have multiple names attached to it. And then for each name, you just specify what language it's in. And then you can also then set a preference to which language you want to see first. So I've helped a few people in the past add Indigenous names from some of the Indigenous languages from around Sydney to certain species. But when it comes to place names, it's a bit trickier because you can see here when I'm editing this place, there's only an option for one name essentially. So in those cases, it would have to be adding the name in brackets, whether you had the Indigenous name in brackets or if you had the anglicized name in brackets would be up for, I guess, discussion. Obviously, the preference in a lot of cases, especially for Fraser Island, would I think would be to have the Indigenous name first. But this is something that I would probably flag first and discuss just to avoid edit wars, which may end up happening. So because you can notice any curator can click on that and edit it and change the name. So preferably you want to just put a flag up first and just notify people that you're making the change just so it doesn't randomly happen. Someone sees it, doesn't know why you changed it, changes it back. And then sometimes you get a bit of back and forth with changing. So it's always good just to flag those things. But yeah, a long answer to that question. There are some Indigenous place names in iNaturalist, but they're very few and far between. But certainly it would be a great thing for more of them to be added. And if people do want to do that, I can help out with that. I will get to your question, Nick, in a second. I will just do one or two more points because I'm aware I've already sucked up 30 minutes of the presentation. So I'll just get onto one or two other quick points that I wanted to talk about, and then I'll get back to your question. So I've done the two place things. The other thing I wanted to just note is about things on the map. So this is just a little handy tip for figuring out what things are on the map. So sometimes people only want to look at research grade observations, right? So if we just zoom in here. So you'll see that there are actually different symbols on the map on iNaturalist. So let's say I want to browse the map just by dragging my mouse around, but I'm only interested in looking at research grade observations, for example. And let's say I don't really want to look at needs ID. I only want to see observations that have had their ID confirmed and for which I'm pretty sure the observation has been correctly identified. You can see here that there are actually multiple different symbols on the map. You can see that some of the points have a little white circle inside of them and some of them don't. And the difference between those is that the ones with a little white circle in them are research grade, and the ones that lack that white circle are still needs ID. So that's just a really nice, easy, simple way of looking at the map and being able to quickly assess whether observations, whether you want to click on them or not. The one with the white circle in the marker is research grade. The one without the circle is needs ID. The other thing you'll notice as well is that these are little pins on the map. There is another type of symbol, and that's the circle. So you can see here there is essentially a grayed out circle. The grayed out circle is an obscured record. So if we go there, you can see that that record is obscured. So I'll be able to see the true coordinates here because it's my observation, of course, but you can see here the little I. So whenever you see this little I on an observation, it means it's obscured. And indeed, if you press details, you can see there's an explanation. So you can see why the coordinates are obscured is because this taxon is threatened. So great crested tern is listed as endangered at this location. The other thing on the map as well that you might have noticed is that there's different colors for the points. And these actually relate to different groups of organisms. So you notice on the map here, you've got orange, you've got blue, you've got green. So if we click on one of them, you'll see that the orange, so these are generally invertebrates. So these are animals that are invertebrates. The blue points are animals that are vertebrates, so things like mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, etc. The green, you'll notice that there are green points as well. The green points are plants. And then there's a couple of other colors as well. You can get purple points, which are fungi, like it's like a purpley pink. And then there's also brown points, which I think are protozoans in my memory. I can quickly search for those. So if I search for protozoans and I just go across and we zoom in. So they're the dark purple. So protozoans are a dark purple. And if we look at fungi, they're pink. And there's also another color, brown, which might be one of the algal groups. But essentially, it's just a really nice, easy way. So if I was to remove that filter, is just if you're looking at the map, you can very quickly assess what all these different observations represent. So you can say, okay, green, I know that's a plant. Blue, I know that's some kind of vertebrate. Orange, I know it's an invertebrate, and so on and so forth. So these are all just really nice ways of being able to look at the map when you've got lots and lots of observations being presented to you, and you can just quickly assess what all of these different markers and points actually mean. So to answer Nick's question, so Nick said, can you clarify the value of adding projects, tags, and observation fields? So good question. So these are all very different things and for all very different purposes. So tags, in my mind, tags are probably the most, not probably, definitely the most underused and probably undervalued aspect of iNaturalist. I never use tags myself, but I know a lot of people do. They're essentially a way of making observations more searchable for particular phrases that might not appear normally. And to explain that, so how to add tags, you'll see on any given observation, if you go to one of your own observations, you can see here, there's a little box that says tags, and I can add a tag. Now, the reason that it's useful is that if I'm going to the Explore page and I go to filters, I can actually search for words that appear in tags. So if I was to search for the word blue, and let's go New South Wales, just so it's not so many observations. I am now seeing all observations that have been uploaded somewhere in New South Wales that have the word blue somewhere in the description or a tag or as part of a name. So I'm pretty sure this species has, yeah, so it's because it's blue mountains in this case. So it's a way of, so if I go this one's also going to be blue mountains, I bet you. Yep, also blue mountains. So that's an annoying example, but essentially what that search filter is doing, this search filter is searching for anywhere in the notes section, anywhere in the place name description, or anywhere in the tags for this particular keyword. So essentially tags are a way of making your observations more findable to other people if they are searching for these particular specific phrases. So let's say someone was interested in all kinds of carnivores. Let's say someone was interested in looking at observations of bears and cats and dogs and all these carnivorous mammals. But normally it would be a little bit difficult to search for all of them at the same time because they're all from different taxonomic groups and they might be from different places in the world. You might search for something like, so if I actually change the place name, let's say I change the place name to Canada, and let's say I change my filter to something like predator. You can see that here are observations that have the tag predator somewhere in them, or they have the text predator. So you can see here, and you'll notice here it's a fuzzy search, so it actually searches for words that are similar as well. So you can see here the word predating is in the description, so it does find close matches as well. Or if I go to something like this observation of this damselfly, you can see you've got predating in the description here as well. I'll find one for you right now that actually has the tags in it just to show you. So this particular user, so Nicholas, he is a great user of tags. Now that I've said that, I'll probably open an observation that doesn't have tags, but here we go. So you can see here tags. So that means that anytime someone uses that search bar and they search for any one of these 4 phrases, this observation will appear amongst others in the search. So it's just a really nice way of making your observations more findable. You can add them when you're uploading or after you've uploaded observations. So it's before uploading is a much faster way to do it if you want to apply the same tags to multiple observations at the same time. But in essence, adding tags is just a way of broadening the ways in which your observation can be searched by others, essentially. Because now, like without those tags, someone would have to search for October Day specifically to find this observation, or they would have to search for Queensland or Tambourine Mountain. But now it also appears in sector, right? So, or I'll find I can find a much better example, something hopefully like this. It's got some different tags. He's probably just got the same tags. Here we go. So for example, if someone was searching for this specific reserve name, they would now find this observation, whereas they normally wouldn't have found it before without this tag if they were searching for that particular phrase. So it's not something that's mandatory by any means, but it's just a way of making things more searchable. Observation fields is a bit different. So observation fields is adding additional metadata to your observations. So this can be things like relationships between species. So if there was a spider eating a bug in an observation, you could add a predator field. So something like predating, you could add the observation field, and then you can say what the prey item is. Or I could add something like color morph. So there are observations for color morphs, observation fields. So there are tens of thousands of observation fields. So you can see here, I can pick different options. So obviously some observation fields are very, very generalized and can be applied to any observation, whereas other observation fields are really only applicable to certain taxa or to certain places or to certain users. So I could do count, for example. So if there were lots of that observation, I could put 2, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. So essentially, to keep it short, observation field, I could do an entire presentation on these. But essentially observation fields are a way of adding additional metadata and information to your observations, because people can then search those observation fields and search for like observations. So just to give an example of that as well, if I was to go to one of my butterfly observations, and we'll find one that is pollinating something. Here we go. So this black Jezebel was pollinating a Woolsea pungens. So I've added these observation fields. So for this particular observation field, it's flower/plant name. So what plant was the pollinator visiting? Woolsea pungens. So now I've added this extra piece of information that the butterfly was pollinating this particular plant species. And indeed, if I was to then left click on this little bar, you can also view observations with this field and value. So now I can look at all observations that people have uploaded where they've said some kind of pollinator is pollinating Woolsea pungens. And you can see there are 2 butterfly observations here. Or if I go back, I can click observations with this field in general. So this is now looking at all observations where someone has added the observation field, the pollinator species. So you can see all these observations are of different insects that are pollinating some kind of plant. So a lot of the recent ones you can see are bumblebees. If we were to go up and we'll go to the species tab, you can see there are more than 900 different species on iNaturalist where someone has added that particular observation field. So of course, a lot of them are bees, but there are also flowers, beetles, butterflies, hoverflies, you name it. So they're just a really nice way of adding this additional information that can then be searched for, or you can also export observation fields. So observation fields are often used in research in iNaturalist because that kind of data can actually be exported into a CSV file and be used. Projects, again, I'll try to keep that very brief because I could do a whole presentation on projects. But essentially, projects are useful/important because they are a way of collecting observations that share some kind of common theme into one place that is easy to find and easy to search through and explore. So projects, the unifying theme for projects can be anything and everything. It can be a spatial theme. So it might be all observations in Sydney, or it can be a taxonomic theme. So it could be all butterflies, or it could be a set of dates. So all observations between the 1st of July and the 31st of July, or it could be by life stage. So you want to see all observations that have been annotated as a caterpillar in one particular place. Or it can be combinations of all of those. So I could see all observations of butterflies that have been annotated as a caterpillar that have been observed in New South Wales that were seen between the 1st of July and the 31st of July. So the combinations are endless, but essentially you can create a project on any kind of unifying theme or combination of themes, and it then allows you to create essentially a central repository for all of those projects. There's 2 main types of projects, traditional and collection. Collection projects take those filters that you've defined and they automatically collect the observations for you, whereas traditional projects, you have to manually add your observations to them. The reason for that is that traditional projects are usually based on some kind of unifying theme that does not have an automatic filter. So a really good example of that is the Found Feathers project. So that's an observation that collects photographs that people upload of just feathers. So there's no real way, obviously, for the computer to be able to automatically recognize whether an observation is just of a feather or if it's of a bird itself. So that's one way you have to manually add the observation. And the reason that it's such a useful tool is that there are some people who are really good at identifying just feathers. So if you want to get your feather ID'd more easily, then you can add your observation of that feather to the Found Feather project, and then it's more likely to be seen by a feather expert and more likely to be identified. So as I said, I could talk about projects for quite some time, but long story short, it's a way of collecting observations with some kind of unifying theme or themes into one centralized place that is a lot easier to search for and find. Len said, I noticed a dicots field there. Frustratingly, the Queensland Herbarium has dropped the distinction dicots because it's an anachronism. Simple and modern dicots is a complex, so all monocot should include. Now defined as land plants. Yeah, so yeah, some observation fields are defunct. Some observation fields aren't useful. There's literally tens of thousands of them that have been created. So a lot of the time, if you want to use observation fields, you do have to do a little bit of searching just to find the appropriate one. So Karen said, if you can't find your item, what can you do for observation field? So do you mean, so Karen, do you mean if you're trying to add some kind of observation field that doesn't exist already? Just to clarify that. And then to answer Jessica's question, does the tag feature override the obscure setting in small reserves? So that's, yeah, so that's an interesting question. So only if you search in that specific tags bar. So if I was to have an obscured observation, so yeah, actually that's a really, really nice question, actually. So if I was to, let's say I had observed something in Smith Reserve, the really small reserve, and it was obscured. If I was to search in either this location bar or this location bar for Smith Reserve, and I was to go to the place, then the obscuration is still fine. But if you had written Smith Reserve as a tag on your obscured observation, and you were to search in this tag search box, then you would be able to find it. That's correct. And so theoretically, you are overriding it. So that is a good point to kind of be cognizant of. If you've got something that's obscured and you don't want to reveal the location, probably avoid putting tags on it, just because it's one further way that someone could narrow down the location. Okay, so I've got about 10 minutes left. So I might deal with flagging because I think that's an important thing to talk about. And yeah, just Karen, if you could clarify, do you mean if you're looking to add some kind of observation field or extra metadata, but it doesn't exist, like there's no observation field that is already present? Is that what you mean? So flagging. So one of the most common reasons for flagging things is to add new species. So let's say I make an observation of some rare or esoteric species, and I go to add the name and it's not there, right? So let's say I go to suggest an ID and I start typing in the name and I know that this name is correct and nothing comes up. So there's two different things you can do. So the first thing, if the name you've typed in, or really the first thing before that, if you type in a name and it's not appearing, is make sure you double check the spelling, that you've got it correct and that it's a current name. But if the name is definitely correct, you know you've ID'd this correctly and the name isn't there, that's because iNaturalist doesn't always have every species. Sometimes they have to be manually added by a curator. The first thing you can do, though, is click this Search External Name Providers button. So what this does is it searches through a few databases outside iNaturalist, and a lot of the time it can actually retrieve that name for you, and essentially it adds it for you. But sometimes if you click this bar, if it's like a particularly obscure species, you'll see it says no results found. So in that case, I need to flag the next highest taxonomic level for that species to be added, which in this case is genus. So what I would do is I would go to the genus Melaleuca. If I wanted to add a new species, for example, this now takes me to the taxon page for this particular genus. I would scroll down a bit and you'll see just here is a box that says curation. You'd click the box and then you would click flag for curation. And here you can give a little reason, because please add new species Melaleuca. And then you can add a comment, and usually in the comment you might provide the source. So you might say something like species in iNat, here's a link to it, and then add a link showing that it is a legitimate species. And then you click flag it, and essentially when it gets flagged, it appears in the little flags box, which you can see over here on the right-hand side. So you can see all these flags. And then once it's there, curator will be able to see it, and they can manually add the species for you. So that's a really important piece of functionality to be aware of for if you observe species that aren't in iNaturalist yet. Alternatively, if you don't want to flag something, just feel free to tag me in the observation and I can add it for you. So Karen, yes. Okay, so if you want to add some kind of observation field, but it doesn't exist yet, you can create observation fields yourself. So anyone can create an observation field, but just the most important thing I always say to keep in mind is that make sure you look through all the existing observation fields so that you're not duplicating them, because there are a lot of double ups. For example, if I was to look at that count one, there are heaps of different counts that people have added. But let's say, I'll just add this for now, because it's a bit tricky to get to the link. Observation fields, new observation field. So I'll post this link in the chat. So that's the link if you want to add a new observation field. So what you have to do is you have to give it a name. So the name should obviously be something relatively short and quite informative. So it's not ambiguous what the observation field is for. You can add a short description, providing some extra clarifying information. You can change the data type. So this will control what people can enter as values for the observation field. So if you have text, it essentially becomes a free-form answer and people can type in anything. If you have numeric, then it means that people can only enter a number. The same for date and time. Obviously, those are fairly straightforward. You can also have multiple choice options. So if you only want particular options available, say yes, no, what you would do is you would type the first option and then you would do the pipe on your keyboard and then the other option. So the pipe on your keyboard should be somewhere on the right-hand side. On my keyboard, at least, it's above the enter key and below the backspace, and you have to just hold shift and then the key. So then that means that if people go to enter this observation field, it'll actually be a drop-down multiple choice option for them where they can only pick yes or no. But for something like nest box, there should be ones that already exist. So if I just delete this observation field here. So I suspect there should already be ones. So there are a few, so there are nest box ones. So for example, if you just want to note the presence of a nest box, there is already this nest box one. But there are multiple other options that you can see when I start to type in nest box. There's things like ID number, notes, activity, date observed. So it's okay to create new ones, but just make sure you have a search through and see whether an observation field that is applicable for you already exists. And we had another question from Vicky. So Vicky said, can I confirm if an observation of a threatened species with a scrambled location would also be bumped from a project where I set up the place/boundary? It's a state park. So it all depends on the size. It is really dependent. So where you set up the place, if it's a very small place, then it's almost certain that it will be bounced. Because keeping in mind, remember I said the obscuration, it will put it into a roughly 500 square kilometer box. And from wherever the true point is, it can end up a maximum of about 29 kilometers away. So if you've got quite a small place, it will almost certainly be bounced out of your project. If you've got a very big place, then it will probably be retained. So if I've got a project based on all of Greater Sydney, then it'll probably stay within there. So it's very context dependent. And if you find that one of your observations is getting bounced, the first thing to check is to whether it's obscured, and then to kind of look at your place and think how big it is. In most cases, your place is going to be too small. So there are ways around that. You can create a traditional project where you manually add things instead of letting it automatically collate. Obviously, that's more work for yourself. But yes, absolutely, things can get bounced out. So I see I've only got a couple of minutes left. So I might just do one last little thing, and then I'll just open it up to any last questions people had. One feature that is a little bit hidden is the ability to reorder photos after you've uploaded an observation. So let's say, for example, I have this particular one, and I uploaded my 4 photos, and they're in this particular order, right? So it's this photo, then this one, then this one, then this one. But let's say I made this decision at first, but now I'm not happy with this one being first. I actually want this close-up to be the first photo. You don't have to delete it and re-add it. You don't have to redo the observation. All you have to do is click edit. So of course you can only do this on your own observations. Click the blue edit button, and now it's a little bit hidden. If you scroll down here, you can see right down here, there's actually a little blue hyperlink which says Reorder Photos. So if I click that, I now get these boxes. And what I do is I now type in the new order of the numbers. So here I would type 1, and then let's say I type 2 here, 3, and then 4. Then I click Update Photos. It'll take me back to this screen. I make sure I click Save. And if we go to the observation, you'll see that now I've got my close-up as the first photo. So that's just a nice little handy way if you decide to change your mind afterwards that you want to reorder the photos, that you can kind of easily do it. But it's a feature that's, as you can see, it's quite small text and it's hidden away a little bit. And then, yeah, you can pretty much change it back at any time whatsoever. So I might wrap it up there, as I see it is 8:59 now, and I've gone well up to the time limit, as I always do with these presentations. But please, yeah, feel free to add any more questions that you have. So Vicky said, yes, it's small. Yep. So that's unfortunately the downside of obscuration on iNaturalist, is that things are going to get bounced out. And it's just kind of one of these things that you have to accept, unfortunately, in exchange for protecting those locations. It is a bit annoying. And Len said, do you tend to upload from device and then work on desktop? No. So I almost never, ever upload observations from the app, ever. The only time I will ever upload observations from the iNaturalist app on my phone is if, say, I'm out on some errand, or I'm at uni or something, and I see a random weed in the pavement, or I see a bug on a plant. I'll snap a quick photo and then upload it via the app. Apart from that, I will only ever use the desktop, just because the desktop has so much more functionality and it's so much easier and faster to upload observations. So if I do take a lot of photos on my phone, but I then download them to my computer and then upload them via the computer. And the reason for that is that for anyone who does use the app, you'll know that you can only upload one observation at a time. But if I've gone out and I've taken hundreds of photos, then that would be a hugely time-consuming process for me to upload all of them. So I'll just download it to the computer, and then I could upload 100, 200 observations simultaneously. And this is especially the case if you've got an iPhone. The iNaturalist app on iPhones has a lot less features than the Android app, which in then turn has a lot less features than the desktop. So I always highly recommend using the desktop where you can. And also, Colin and Wendy said, when's the advanced session? Michelle, is there an advanced session? Am I doing an advanced session?
We haven't booked it in yet.
Okay, no
So
worries.
it'll probably be in September. So FYI, keep an eye on our YouTube channel for that one. On that note, I just want to say thank you very much, Thomas, for your presentation.